Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our monthly Zoom call. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Sondra Arkin has to say. But before we go there, a couple things, just normal etiquette. Please mute your machine so we can listen to Sondra and not to you mooing or chewing or whatever you're doing. Also, if you could please hold all your questions till the end of the session. Sondra's going to make time for that. And as usual, we will be recording and then transferring today's conversation to YouTube, which will be available to all our members. But before I turn it over to Sarah Sarabi to introduce Sondra, I want to remind people to please go see the Glenview Mansion Gallery, the exhibit Winter Garden. It is absolutely beautiful. And when it's cold out, what better way to get warm, plus the heat works in the mansion, than to see a lot of botanicals. And it is really a beautiful show. So please get out and see it. You've got a week left. The last day of the show is the 14th. So please get out there to see it. Again, everybody, mute your machine, your device. And Sarah, would you like to introduce Sondra for us?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. So Sondra is here with us tonight. She's a professional artist and curator. Awards and grants and numerous solo and group exhibitions at museums and galleries are listed in the latest issue of our newsletter, Earthly newsletter. I discovered Sondra by listening to one of the ACO conferences. So ACO is the Art Clinic Online series organized by Jordan Bruns and Mariana Kastrinakis. And I was immediately taken aback by the breadth of her skills, her interests, and her ability to make collaboration with so many people on so many projects and be so successful. I thought that our group at the Rockville Art League needs to hear about this. And so I asked her to meet with her. And she graciously invited me to visit her in her studio near DuPont Circle. And there, while we're sipping tea, I learned that she has many backgrounds in literature, in science, in high-tech marketing. I learned that she started her career in watercolors and then moved to oil pastels, to encaustic printing, sculpture, and she makes these beautiful three-dimensional sculptures of metal and light. Reflected in Sondra's work is her care for nature, the way she cares for the way we interact with our surroundings, the way we treat or mistreat our environment, and what the consequences might be on climate change and population welfare. So I'm going to let Sandra use her own word to talk about all these wonderful things. Sandra, welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for having me come and speak with you today. I'm quite honored and humbled, I think, a little bit. I think that sharing our experiences among other artists is a really important part of what I think makes us better artists. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about my background and some of the organizations that I've been involved with and some of the collaborations that I've done. And what I'll do is I'll talk. And you can certainly put any questions that you might have in the chat, but let's reserve conversation about that until the end so that I don't completely lose my train of thought, which is always possible. and exciting to do that. It's just like making art, right? So I'm going to share my screen if you give me just a moment. And just need to move this out of the way. Okay, so first I'll talk a little bit about my person. As Sarah said, I have a varied background, and like a lot of artists that I know and I admire in the Washington area, and probably like a lot of you, I had a different career before I started making art. I was very lucky that I was able to switch careers when I was about 40 years old and move into becoming a professional artist. But I started in science. I studied science in college, but I ended up getting my degrees in literature, partly because I just ran out of bucks. And then I ended up having a career in high-tech marketing. And what was interesting to me about that was that I had no idea at the beginning that my interest in data was what was going to drive me into working in high-tech marketing. And that data interest even now drives a lot of the way I practice my art. I'm very process driven. So whether it's the art making or the administration or organizing, how I approach the making is really important to me. I am also really curious about systems and organizations and data and networks. And so I think about a lot of how something can be made to work better. And so that the engineering piece of my work also becomes really important to me. I'm an explorer and I do a lot of experimenting in my studio. And I know that a lot of artists also share this idea that you might want to be playing and experimenting and seeing what's happening. So I have really resisted over time becoming pigeonholed into any particular media. I tend to switch into whatever I feel like using for the particular art that I'm trying to make. And different points in my life, I work with different types of materials. I'm very committed to the environment. As a matter of fact, especially since the pandemic, I made a commitment to not purchase any new art supplies, and I have plenty in my studio. And there's plenty of stuff around in the world that I can make artwork out of. And I believe a lot that many hands make light work. And that's really part of what I'm focusing on today in my talks is how I work with other artists in the projects that I work in and with other organizations. So for community and collaborations and thinking about them, one of the first ideas to talk about is that making art can be isolating. I don't have shared studio space. I've never had shared studio space. And I am pretty much happy to be on my own all day making stuff. But I found that having moved out of an office environment, which is what I was working in before, into making art, that it was really isolating. And so the idea of being able to share resources and ideas with other artists was really important to me. And so I became involved with particular organizations in the Washington area that would allow me to meet other artists and to share resources and ideas. And also it would allow me to develop ideas and techniques. We were talking at the beginning, before we started here, that Patrick mentioned the torpedo factory. And for all of the years when I had another job, I took classes at the torpedo factory. And yes, it was a schlep to go out to Virginia for me, but it was important to me to get out there and to have something regular, to focus on. Oh, I've lost control of my slideshow, so one second. The other reason that we want to have community and collaborations is that it allows us to build an audience. And, you know, because I have this background in marketing, it's sometimes difficult for me to separate out where the show is going to end up and how the audience is going to interact with it when I make the art. So one of the first things I did 25 years ago when I got involved with the Washington art community was I participated in Artomatic. Artomatic started in 1999. I don't know, I'll tell a little tiny bit about it. It's a completely volunteer run art program that runs for about a month, and every bit of it is volunteer run. I participated in it a couple of times before I started working on the administration of Artomatic, and subsequently I was on the very first board of Artomatic and the very first president, and I met a lot of people through Artomatic, and it was a really important community activity. So it allowed me to do all those community pieces that I was talking about. I was able to build a network of people. It gave me an exhibition opportunity. I learned about different techniques. I learned people who use different media. I met people with different media. And Artomatic also isn't just a visual arts festival. It had all kinds of art. So it had theater and dance and music. And it challenged me because I'm not that much a people person, but it did give me an opportunity to be among a lot of other people. The other thing that happened very early when I first started working as an artist was we developed a consortium downtown in Washington called Mid-City Artists. We started in 2002, and we formed a consortium of artists who had studios in a particular location. So it was DuPont Circle to Logan Circle, sort of in the what we call the Old City neighborhood. And we ran open studios twice a year. And it was really only for open studios that we started this project. And until about 2020, it was a really very successful program. We had very high crowds. It was really important to me to have people come to the studio because that also helped me think through the projects that I was working on. And what I learned at this time was that, well, I really liked exchanging ideas with artists and people came into my studio. I'm not very good about working in community-based art projects. They were really challenging for me when it was a project that the community might be participating in. And I think that there are other artists in the Washington area who do a much better job than I do of making projects where the community actually makes the work with them. So most of the work that I do has to do with projects that I do with other artists about collaborations. So there's many ways that I look at these collaborations that you can do with other artists. There's the side-by-side collaboration, which is how most collaborations are done. I call that this divide and conquer. You're going to be over here and I'm going to be over here. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There's a parallel play where you develop one thing through experimenting. And I'm going to also talk about a project where we did this kind of parallel play. You can have collaborations that involve a master craftsperson like a printmaker. Printmaking often is that kind of collaboration, I feel. There's also a joint collaboration where you literally are making something together. And that's been pretty rare for me, but I have worked on those kind of collaborations. And the most recent one that I'm working on now has been that kind of collaboration. And there are also collaborations where you have separate roles and that you're very clear about dividing up those roles into administrative and creative or other ways like that. So this is an example of a collaboration that I did, some work that I did in a collaboration with Mary Beth Ramsey at the Nevin Kelly Gallery, where the theme of the show was called Poetic License. And all of the work that we each did for this show was text-based work. And I had at this point started working in encaustic, which I do a lot of my work is encaustic based or wax based work, and started making these sculptural pieces where you can see the work shooting out on the left, and then these built up pieces where I deconstructed books and then reconstructed them together. And the piece that's on the far right is a completely constructed, there's no lined legal paper in there. That's actually all out of wax. And Mary Beth and I proposed this show to Nevin. We wanted to do this text-based work together. So that is the kind of collaboration where we were working side by side in this divide and conquer manner. I did a show around the same time at the Black Rock Center for the Arts, and I was working to make some pretty sizable encaustic work. And these pieces in this photograph are all 48 by 48 inch panels. And it's a lot larger than most people work with encaustic, which I actually didn't know at the time. I just wanted to make bigger pieces. So I started working on a material called dye bond, which is a sign making material. It's actually an aluminum based material. And I sought out a couple of people who were working on dye bond to make paintings and determined that I could do it for this encaustic work. And at the Black Rock Center for the Arts, they put me together in a show with Carol Goldberg and Greg Mina, which was a really nice pairing. Greg's up in Baltimore and Carol's been here for a long time in Washington. Subsequent to that, I worked on this show at the Gateway Art Center, Brentwood Art Exchange with Susan Finson and Ellyn Weiss that we called Big Ideas, but it included a piece called Community Spirit. And the proposal to the Brentwood Art Exchange was that we would do this project and we would invite the community to participate in the project with us. But in order to create this project, Ellyn and Susan and I met every week for about 6 months. And we just shared artists that we were interested in. We shared techniques that we were playing with. We played together. And I would say that this show fundamentally changed my artwork. And that's what some of these examples are. On the left, this installation piece was, we fabricated all of these things that look like they're made out of rusted steel. They are almost all styrofoam or found objects that we rusted to look rusted. Every bit of that is contrived. And these airy wire pieces that are in there, in our search, we had been looking through Community Forklift and found some rebar tie wire, which is a construction wire that's used in making cement forms. And I had started constructing these clouds, and Ellyn and Susan and I worked together on them in one of the weekly sessions that we had, and then determined that neither Ellyn nor Susan wanted to make these things. And I made about 20 of them for this show. And then subsequently, as you'll see, I sort of went crazy and made a lot more of them. In the middle, you see what is a large piece as well. It's actually a 48 by 48 inch piece, but this is the first time I started working with wax and shellac. And I wanted to work more and more with these natural materials, and beeswax and shellac are both made from bugs, insects. And I started working in this layering technique with the encaustic with shellac and wax. And Susan and Ellyn and I, we did this combined piece, and this is a really good example of how you can work in collaboration with someone and have no idea what it's going to look like. We literally showed up to do this installation and put these pieces together without a preconceived idea of what they would look like, and had 3 different ideas of how that would look. And so that's a challenge, and it's a challenge. That's the best I can say. It was a great show, but it was really hard because of that. We invited the community in to, there was a section place where they could write tags on their thoughts of this change of the neighborhood, because the Brentwood Arts Exchange was part of this art overlay in the Mount Rainier area. In the studio, I started working more on these wire pieces, and I love showing this piece, this photo in the middle that sort of shows the process by which I make these pieces. I first cut lengths of wire, I then turn them into these wishbones, and then I weave them together. There's some other pieces on the side, and the relationship between all the work that I do is pretty close, because it's all formulated around the spaces that you can contrive. This is a little bit more an example of how these wire pieces go together. And I thought it would be interesting to look at the pieces in the studio, because it was the collaboration at the Brentwood Arts Exchange that opened the door for me to make all this sculpture that then continued in other collaborations. Subsequent to that, I then was in a show with Eve Stockton, who's a printmaker here in town. We did a show at Longview Gallery called Networks, and it was all about this data, these pieces that were about data visualization. And I started working more with the wire pieces, which you can see. I love looking at that picture, actually. It sort of just looks like hairballs of air to me. But this was a show also, which was a very divide and conquer. This was even more divide and conquer than the show with Mary Beth Ramsey, because we literally had two sections of the gallery space, right? So here's a collaboration where the work is related, and you're here and I'm here, and that's how we're going to put this show together. From that show, I was invited to a number of different shows, and ultimately to the American University Museum. Jack Rasmussen put me together with Joan Belmar and Mary Early for a show that was ultimately called Twist Layer Pour. This is also a collaboration where you have this space, I have that space. And so the second floor of the museum was divided into these three sections and we were invited to do these installations. And I have to say that this collaboration in particular was super challenging. We got together and started talking about it. Mary Early had, I think, a pretty well-conceived idea of her piece, which is in the lower right-hand corner, those wax strips that she put along the floor. I think that she had actually approached Jack, and she knew that she was going to do this piece in this installation. And Joan and I came in and we were like, well, I don't know, we don't know what we're going to do. Jack wanted me to work with the wire, and I had not worked at this scale before. So I went from the 20 pieces that I made for Brentwood to making 600 pieces to make this installation. These are two pieces in the top row. One is called Cloud Forest and the other is Mist. And the Cloud Forest pieces are suspended from the ceiling, and they are on motors. And the motors are either on timers or motion detectors. And I became very intrigued with this idea that you could get inside the art. And I really wanted to get the art off the wall in a way that people could get inside the art. So, and Joan really wanted to work in this center section with light. And it was really great to be able to talk with them about how we could accomplish what we were trying to accomplish in each of these pieces. This idea of getting inside the piece and really pulling the piece off the wall. Joan really wanted this reflection and this light pieces to work in his section. And Mary really was playing a lot with this Linea project that she'd been working on. And this was also the first time that I worked in an experience where a curator was brought in to help us figure out the relationship between the work. And that was really fun. Sarah Tangay curated the project and helped us find what held our pieces together. Subsequent to that, I was in a show at the Delaware Art Museum, and this was a show that was about impermanence and our place on Earth, or our place in this world. And it was a drawing show. Barbara Warden curated it, and it was a bunch of different artists from the Mid-Atlantic area. I didn't really know them. She brought us all together, and I did a series of drawings for this show based on an earlier project of mine called Permutations Toward Infinity, which are these series that I do, some of those encaustics that you saw. I didn't really talk about it very much, but they are set up. Most of my work can be turned into any direction. So they're set up so that they can hang in any orientation. And when you put them together in sets, the number of permutations is just exponentially greater. And so when you have a set of 3 or a set of 9, you can have literally billions of permutations. And so I had done this for the show, and at the last minute, the curator, Barbara, and the museum asked if I would do a drawing in space to go with it. So I did a dimensional piece to go in coordination with this. Another collaboration I did in 2019, and this is one of my favorite collaborations, is a friend of mine who was a mechanical engineering professor at a college in Pennsylvania. And I got into a discussion at some point about the difference between STEM curriculum and STEAM curriculum. His school particularly focused on STEM curriculum, and they had no art classes in their college at all. And this friend of mine's very creative. He's a poet and a weaver, and I said that I thought we should do a project to really see how an engineer and an artist would work together. And he was able to take a sabbatical semester, and we did this project during this sabbatical semester. And we pretty much started, as I start many of the collaborations that I do with people, with just conversations. How does our worldview overlap, and what are the things that are important to us? And we did a lot of this getting together and going hiking, and decided that we wanted to do a show called Spend Time with Trees. And during this process, we each kept journals. We decided that we wanted the work to be immersive with sound and smells and touch. And we were working at the Art Enables Gallery, which is up in northeast quadrant of Washington. And it also needed to be an accessible show with space for accessibility. And it took us about 4 months to come to what we wanted to do. And I will say that for me, it wasn't successful in one piece, though I learned a lot from this failure, I think. And that was, in my mind, I thought, well, this could be great. I'm going to have an engineer who can help me figure out how to engineer all my pieces. But since he was making his own work and I was making work for this, and we were making work together, he really wasn't there to serve my needs of engineering. So it was more interesting to discover how we engineered together. And there were so many things that he did better than I did artistically And there were things that I felt I did better engineering wise. On the left-hand picture that you see, the back of that door holds a sound piece. So when you walked in that doorway, which is sort of hard to see, but you stepped on a soundboard that made noises. These hanging bamboo pieces that you see, I subsequently showed last year at Artomatic. They're bamboo showers that you can get inside and may make noise. I have one in my studio because I like it so much to get in it and make some noise. And the piece that's on the right, we made this piece out of materials that we scavenged together. And I actually really love that piece. We cut them, we made these stands for it. We covered it with dirt that was found locally. They're little copse groves. In the background of that photograph, you can see there's actually a sound bench that Mark made for this project, that when you swung on it, it also made a sort of soothing noise. So it was great. It was a really great experiment in a lot of ways of what kind of things we could do and how art enhanced his thinking and how engineering enhanced my thinking. And we actually presented a paper on this subsequently at a conference, STEAM conference. In the very background of the middle picture, I know it's hard to see on these slides, you see a bunch of like hanging blue and white things, and they're going to show up in some work coming up soon, I hope. But what I also did was I worked with Helen Frederick at her studio in Silver Spring, Maryland, to make logs, paper. I made handmade paper, which I then formed into these logs out of all the shredded financial documents that were in my attic. So I like to think that I'm getting better about getting rid of the stuff that's here, but I really am, I'm making no headway at all. The next project, another kind of collaboration that I worked on, is working with a master printmaker. I mentioned there's 2 printmaking projects that I worked with that where having someone who was a master printmaker work with me on this was this, as far as I'm concerned, these prints in particular have both mine and Denny's fingerprints on them. Dennis ran a silkscreen workshop in Virginia called the Handprint Workshop, and we did a series of silk screens. These are all silk screen prints, and they're not very big. They're 15 by 15, and there's really not any. There's only two things going on here, but there's no prints that look alike, and it was a really great experience to work with someone who, you know, Dennis had been an instructor at the Corcoran for his whole career, which he said was great because he hung around with 18-year-olds his whole life and it kept him young. But it also, he was the kind of person where I would say, I didn't know what to do next, and he would pose questions for me. And then I would say, well, what would happen if we do this? And he'd be like, I don't know. And then we just leap into doing something. I wanted to work with Dennis because I had seen a program and found out that he mixed wax with his inks. And I was curious about how that worked. So a lot of these pieces have cold wax in the ink, and they have a kind of texture that's really interesting. Another silkscreen project I was invited to be part of was called In Unison, which was a project by the Millennium Art Salon to bring together 20 Washington artists at the George Mason print studio and make these series of prints. And they subsequently showed them at a lot of different venues, including the Krieger Museum here in Washington. They were shown in New York and Southern Virginia. And recently, one of the portfolio sets was just acquired by the Library of Congress, which was pretty cool last year. The print that's on these are both prints of mine. We each did 5 prints for this project, and we worked with the master printmaker on them. And the print that's on the left is the print that was in the exhibition, which is now in my collection. And the print on the right is the one that is part of the portfolio that was acquired by the Library of Congress. And so working on this, I got to meet all of these artists if I didn't know them beforehand. And again, it was an example of where collaboration like this, working in the print studio with them, it was great. I just, certain people would pull out different tools that I'd never seen, and it was pretty exciting. Last year, for most of the year, I don't know, some of you might have seen this show. I worked on I had another show at the American University Museum called The Human Flood. Ellyn Weiss and I have worked on a series of climate-related projects. Ellyn has done 4 or 5 of them with different collaborators, and she and I have collaborated on the last 2. And we had been looking for a venue for the show called The Human Flood that we had conceived of, but we had not made the work for. And once again, the American University just offered us some space, really sight unseen. None of this work was done until we had the venue secured. Ellyn and I decided that we wanted to make this show very different than any other collaboration we'd done before. We wanted it for this collaboration to really have the installation be from both of us, and to have as much of the work that was in this show made by the 2 of us. The show itself, The Human Flood, is about the effects of climate change on migration patterns, and was to bring attention to the mass migration that's underway because of climate change, and how many people are now migrating because the land that they live on is no longer habitable. And so there were 11 pieces to the installation. It ranged from a series of about 85 monoprints that we made together, have our fingerprints on each one of them, a series of scrims that we made. Each of us made a number of scrims, and then we put them together, 3-part video and audio piece, and several other installations that were part of this show. This show is now actually in an abbreviated form, just opened at Salisbury University at Salisbury, Maryland. If you're interested in seeing it, there's actually an opening in February, and it has about half the prints, some of the scrims, the sandbag wall, some of the tents, and it's a show that is including 3 other artists. So I haven't actually seen the whole show, which is another way to do a collaboration. The curator puts you together. So I wanted to just wrap up with some selected community projects that I've worked on over time. Because of my involvement with Artomatic, I was asked to curate the collection that now hangs in the Wilson Building, which is the Washington, D.C. City Hall, you could call it. The collection is called the Heart of D.C., and it's the City Hall Art Collection. And there was a series of projects that Ellyn Weiss and I collaborated on called the Zeitgeist Shows, Found, which is a public art building community program, and then some online. So let's talk about that. The Wilson Building collection is a subset of the Washington, D.C. Art Bank, and it includes artists from the metropolitan area. And it was a really exciting project. I was actually hired by the Arts Commission to do this in 2005. I worked on it for about 5 years. And I had a really, really serious intent to reach as many artists as we could. We defined the metropolitan area for the first time for the Arts Commission. We wanted to have representation from not just all 8 wards of Washington, but also Virginia and Maryland. And it is the largest public art collection that you can see any day of the week down in the Wilson building. So I would encourage you to go and see. They've also added to this collection with a section on from the Corcoran. And it includes artists you may not know of, but also artists you would know, like Alma Thomas, Gene Davis, Sam Gilliam are in that collection. The Zeitgeist exhibits that Ellyn and I did, which if we weren't so terrified, we would do one again. And we have been talking about it for the past 4 or 5 years. The Zeitgeist exhibits are conceived to be about whatever we feel is in the air at the time. In 2008, we did the first Zeitgeist show, and it was about the persistent surveillance that we're all under. And we followed it up a couple of years later with, right after Obama was elected, with a show called What's Important Now. A few years after that, we did another Zeitgeist show called Too Much Information, which was about how much our world has moved to digital. Ellyn and I had sort of differing opinions on that. So we invited a bunch of artists to make art about this. Each one of these projects, we would bring together a group of artists and ask them to make art specific to this theme. And the last show that we did in 2017 called Preconceptual, we actually wrote the description of the artwork at the same time the artists were making the artwork without really any idea of what the other person was doing. So, and the last couple of things I want to talk about is this project in 2023 and 2024 that was conceived by Ira Tattleman. It was an environmental show that we did in the Edgewood section of DC, where we brought people together with all kinds of stuff we collected or they could bring, and then we had the community members make artwork and then showed them for 2 different exhibition days in a park in Washington. And it was all about, you know, stewardship and found objects and what people could create. And people were really creative. This is one of the collaborations where you're actually working with people to make the artwork. And it was quite satisfying. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was online community. During the pandemic, when we all did a lot more online stuff, I started foraging and collecting a lot of materials to make little baskets and start weaving. I had found that the steel had been playing some havoc with my hands to work with the steel. So I wanted to work with something that was a little easier. And so I started collecting on my walks about town all kinds of materials, dead iris and daylily and pine needles and milkweed and things like that. And so I have been working with these materials now for quite a bit of time, and I'm very much looking forward to Sarah has cut some wisteria for me and getting that from her to make some more stuff out of that. So this is the sort of next thing that happens. And I find that this online community has been really essential for me to learn techniques and to create some things. So much so that I'm actually going to a town near Barcelona in April to take a weaving class with somebody I follow on Instagram. So I'll report back on how that goes. And so that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about in collaborations. And then I figured you should have some questions. So if I can figure out how to stop sharing, if I get my...
There you go.
Yay. Okay. So that was a lot. I know it's an awful lot to absorb, and I'm sure that everyone here has probably been involved with collaborations in some way or another. And yeah, let's talk about it.
Sondra, first thing I want to say is that you stayed on topic. Usually you ask somebody to talk about something and then they talk about something else. And I ask you to talk about your collaboration, and that's what you did. I think that's great. That's really nice.
Thank you.
Sondra, these look like, I mean, I feel the effort and the thought and the time that goes into these collaborations. And I was wondering, sounds kind of weird, but how do you fund these? Are they grants that allow you to do this work? So you apply,
Well,
so you must have that administrative thing going on where you're applying for these grants as well, right?
Well, different ones get funded different ways. That's a good question. I mean, some of it is just how I like to play, right? So some of it is, part of just my practice is that I'm in here alone in my head, listening to audiobooks, making stuff. And at some point I've got to like get myself out of this and involve with other people. But I do apply for grants. I'm very lucky. The DC Arts Commission is very generous with our taxpayer money to fund projects. I have gotten an artist fellowship grant from them for many years when I feel like I need to have money for a project. The Human Flood was actually funded both from the Arts Commission and the American University Museum funded some of the um, promotion, the catalog. Those are the things that are really the most expensive when you're doing a project like this. Is the documentation of the project is, to me, a really important part of the project. So having a catalog, having a website, the Human Flood has a website, it has a social media platform. We collaborate with other organizations through the Human Flood. And I think that is now, especially since I'm not really buying art supplies, that's a lot less expensive. So
I was just thinking about the time, the enormous effort you put into these things. I mean, you talked about months and months of planning. So, wow.
well, the Human Flood, I mean, that's a good example. We actually thought of the Human Flood. We finished the Migration of Pestilence, which was our last climate change show. It was in 2017. And I remember distinctly that Ellyn, during the installation, said, the next show needs to be about humans. And she said, the Human Flood is a really good name. Let's do the Human Flood. And I was like, okay. And we talked to a couple of different collaborators who we were involved with, we were interested in working with. For a couple of years, we wrote proposals to a number of places around town. I have to say, I really like to know where the work is going to be. I'm a site-specific creator, so it's hard for me to make work without knowing where it's going to be. Frankly, I need to find a home for my next show because it's taking over my studio without any idea what it's going to be. And we finally, Ellyn was approaching Jack at American University for a different reason, actually. And she mentioned that she was working on the Human Flood, and his response was, I want to do the Human Flood. It was a one-sentence response. And then we showed up at the meeting and I said, Jack, I'm sorry, but Ellyn forgot to tell you that it's the two of us. And he just laughed and said he was good with that. We opened last year, 2024. That was in 2022. And we had none of the work made at that point. So from 2022 until the January 2024, we made all of the work that was in that show. Did I say I'm obsessive? Because that's probably a good thing to know, right? So I'm obsessive in the work that I make and the kind of work that I make. And I really like things that have repeated patterns and repetition in what I'm making. When I worked on the wire pieces for the Twist Layer Pour show, I hired everybody's niece and nephew worked at my studio during the summer for a couple of years. Those poor kids had to make wishbones. I would cut the wire and then they would make the first loop of the wishbone. And then the rest of it I would make myself. But and that's another piece of collaboration and community that's important to me. It's fun.
I had a couple other questions. Shall I just keep rolling? I don't want
Sure.
to be the only one yakking here. With one of your slides of a 3D piece, I was intrigued by the lighting. The lighting looked like it was so integral to the whole experience, the whole art piece. And I'm wondering, when you're thinking through these, are you thinking about the light at the same time you're thinking about the structure? I imagine you are, but could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So I think about the light, but I'm not very good about light. So I bring in professionals who are better than I am at that. When I did the wire pieces, and I should explain that I call them individually turkeys because they're about the size of a turkey. They're little clouds. And they're to me a lot about the space that's in between the wire. And it took several times of showing that work before I realized how important the shadows were. And we actually did an art all night. I did an installation for art all night. And I had done a big hanging piece for it. And a friend came in and turned on his iPhone and started just tossing the piece around and using the flashlight on his iPhone to light it and making these shadows on the wall. And we started talking about the fact that it would be really great to do that piece with the shadows and nothing else. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Freight Gallery, which Julia Bloom is running out of an artist studio space in Northeast, where she invites artists to come in and make work on a Sunday afternoon. It's a 2-hour window to come in and see this work that's literally installed in a freight elevator. And the last artist that they had little puck lights in her pieces that cast shadows. And it's funny that you mentioned the lighting and the shadows, because I was trying to figure out if there was a way for me to do a projection that would just be the shadows and not even have the wire pieces involved at all, and how cool that would be. So the lighting, the shadows is a whole other element to what makes the work, in my opinion, about it being about what we don't see, right? I didn't talk a lot in this presentation about what my work is about for me, but the work for me is often about what we don't pay attention to. So doing a project where it would be all about the shadows would be great, because that's a lot of what we don't look at. So it started as a happy accident, but it became really important to the project.
I'm going to ask one more, and then I'm going to let other people.
Okay.
So I'm thinking about mostly about your larger pieces, the installation ones, the collaborations. So that, let's say it's at American University and the show runs its course, probably lots of acclaim, blah, blah, blah. What do you do with the work after it comes out of there? I mean, your studio looks pretty orderly behind you. Maybe I don't see it all, but do you have like some huge storage area somewhere, or do you repurpose it into your next piece?
Well, I often repurpose it. So I'll give you an example related to the wire pieces that was in that AU show. So the wire pieces, I said there were 600 units when I started that piece, right? So there were 10 units each in a clear plastic trash bag. As someone who transports their artwork very often in garbage bags, I always say, don't use black ones, always use clear ones so that they don't get mistaken for trash. Right? So they're in clear plastic bags. There's 10 in a bag. I mean, my goal is to place as much of that as I can in permanent homes after the show. And I would say that at this point, I've probably placed 2/3 of those pieces in installations in either private residence or corporate situations. and the other bags are in the attic. So that the human flood show, all of the work in the human flood show pretty much can get disassembled and fit in my car. So I don't like having a lot of inventory, and so I play more than I might make in order to keep my inventory in check. That's just my own sort of mental issue. But I mean, I feel like it's really important, and I think I talked about this at the art clinic online, that for me, it's really important that my work goes somewhere and has a home. So I keep my prices pretty reasonable, I think. And I work hard on getting it out into the world, through different show opportunities or art consultants. To be honest, art consultants are the way to go.
Sondra, those installations, are they meant to be outside a sculpture or not? Or maybe would the rust add something to it?
Yes, no, yes, yes, no. Yes. So they're not really meant to be outside, but I mean, the nature of rebar tie wire and this 16 gauge steel wire is that it will rust. There are things that you could do that would slow that rust process down. And while I try to be pretty archival in all of the work that I make, sometimes I have to shrug and say, I hope it outlives me. I mean, that's the intent, right? I've been foraging and making these baskets, and I can tell you from them sitting around in my studio that they change, right? Ones that start out one color change to another color. So this wire, it could go outside. I have had some of it outside, and if people are comfortable with it rusting and changing and deteriorating over time, that seems perfectly
I think it
legitimate
would
to
be
me.
nice to have some rust, maybe. It's
Right.
not
I mean,
necessarily bad.
well, when Ellyn and I did the last show at the last climate change show, Migration of Pestilence, with Veronica Salas, part of Veronica's practice is about the deterioration of the work she makes. So a lot of her work is meant to sit outside and deteriorate. And that's why I can say I don't hold the work precious. So except for it being damaged outside, I think that it would be fine outside. So I see Lillian Blum, you're on this call today. Hello. And I specifically mentioned at the beginning and in my presentation, I don't know if you were on the call, about people who do more work than I do working with the community. So while my work is in community with other artists, I don't work with the community as much. But Lillian, you're an artist who does a lot more, is much more open to working with the community to make the art.
Yeah, I find that very exciting and very rewarding to be able to incorporate feedback from the community into things I work with. And
Yeah, I know that you talked on this topic recently as well.
yeah, it's something I find very rewarding, and I find that it's very rewarding for the people I work with too. I find it's very much a back and forth. And I've just assembled all the pieces to install living room in the lobby of a building in Wheaton Mall, in one of the buildings there. And so that is to invite in the community to participate in dialogue, and also maybe a possible mural down the road. But it's mostly to invite people to come in and talk to me about their dreams for a better future. I'm hoping that the current mood in the country is not going to scare people away from sitting down and chatting. But yeah, you're all welcome. It should open pretty shortly, and there will be coffee and snacks.
Always good to have.
So
When
come
we
on.
did community spirit at the Brentwood Art Exchange, that was actually the question that we asked people, was their thoughts for the future. And we had a section of the show where we had wire strung along the wall in a sort of a spider web pattern, and they could write their thoughts and then attach it to that.
Did you put them together? Did you write them down somewhere? Like,
We must have photographs of it somewhere, but
yeah,
we didn't do anything with it after the show. I
okay,
think people just enjoyed looking at what these ideas were. So
yeah,
we had some kind of tag that we made specifically that they could write on. And then when it was done, it was all covered with these tags, sort of like the Yoko Ono wishing tree kind
okay,
of installation, I think.
okay, yeah.
But I thought, since you have someone right in your group who is doing much more community oriented work,
Well,
that would be good.
I think yours is quite community oriented yourself, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's something I've really grown more into the more I have had. I mean, my kids have moved away and things like that. I feel that I have more of a need for community myself. And so reaching out and working with people find very fulfilling, whether it's, teaching or working in community work, artwork, and yeah, I really
Yeah,
enjoy
I
it.
agree. I think it's important to stay connected that way. So I think that's a really important part of the community aspect. When we did the Found project last year and the year before, um, it was a really interesting experience for me. I was hired to be a facilitator. And so people could come in and they could bring their own stuff, or they could come in with no idea of what they wanted to do. And then our job was to help them find stuff so that they could make stuff. And people were really talented and they were very motivated. And it actually was way more fun than I expected. But it was very much I was not in the I was in the adult section. Let me just put it that way. I
Mm,
wasn't someone who worked with kids at all.
mhm.
So I would work with people who came in specifically to make work for this.
So I'm also interested in involving other artists to come and sit in my living room and share small crafts projects or a small art project that they would like to do with the community. So I was thinking of reaching out to they have this crocheting and knitting group in Wheaton that does like yarn bombing. And so I was thinking it'd be fun if they would come in and work on something. And I was also thinking of having sort of a lending or giving away library as part of the installation. And so if anybody has books they want to get rid of, kids' books in Spanish, let me know. I can come pick them up. That would be great. Also, anybody who wants to come and do a little demo of something and involve the community. That would be lovely too. Yes, thank you, Sondra, for letting me put that in today. I hadn't thought of that. Yes, that's a good place to do a plug for that.
Well, good.
Thank you.
Sondra, I'm going to ask you another one because I just find you very interesting. Thank you. You didn't go from literature to marketing, and then all of a sudden you're doing wishbones and installations. What was your progression? Did you start out doing representational things and taking classes, and then it evolved into these installations, or just a few
Well, when
thoughts
I
on
went to
that?
college, when I went to college as an undergraduate, I actually was a science and art major, and I took all of the art classes that I might have taken to get an art degree. But as I said, I ran out of money, and somehow I was able to get enough credits in literature because I took a lot of literature classes, and so I doubled down. Nothing like taking 24 credits in a semester of literature classes. Let me just tell you that it's a lot of reading. and graduated that way. And then I went to graduate school and decided that I wanted to teach on a sailboat, maritime history and maritime literature. So my graduate degree is actually in maritime literature. It's crazy and specific as that is. But I always did art the whole time, right? So I was making art, and I was very specifically involved in this aspect of American literature, American history, that is the maritime history of America. But then I decided at some point, I was teaching, I taught at universities, that I had to eat. I lived in South Florida. I taught at 5 different universities, and it was a grueling life in my 20s. I was hardly making a living, and I thought that would give me time to make art. That's specifically why I took that route, and it did not. And so I picked up a job at a what was a microcomputer firm at the time, and I found that I was really good at what they asked me to do. And I always took art classes. I felt like that was just my way of staying in it. Tuesday was art class night. I'd found whatever class I could find that was on a Tuesday, and I took classes at the Washington Studio School, at the Torpedo Factory, through the Smithsonian, once I'd moved up to here to Washington. And I just continued that. So what was the trajectory? I think I'm pretty shortly moved into abstract work. I did representational work in school. And occasionally I do things that people think have representational qualities now, mostly that have to do with trees, I would say. But for me, abstraction was about the ideas. And so I also moved pretty quickly away from, well, that's not really true. I would say I was in color field abstraction for a good part of my career. And a lot of what you see are very high color contrasts. But even with the color abstraction, they are about the thinking of the relationship of what you're making, not what you're seeing. And I think that I then subsequently got much more involved with the concepts of seeing beyond what was in front of you. I don't know if that answers the question, but
It does. Thank you. Are there any more questions for Sondra before we?
Yes. What's
say
your
goodbye?
favorite maritime book? Would you recommend?
whew. Well, it's funny, and it might sound cliche now, but I will tell you that I avoided Moby Dick for most of my educational career, and then I listened to it in the studio, and I fell in love with it, and I've actually listened to it a couple of times. So as an audiobook, there's actually a version at the library by a reader called Adams Morgan.
Oh.
And he was a great reader for that book, and I really loved that book. But I think I was originally drawn to books that were about solo sailing around the world. So, and if you don't follow Cole Breyer on Instagram, you should, because she's a young woman who won a solo sailing around the world last year, and she's great and inspiring.
Was that something you wanted to do? Sail the world solo?
No, I don't really have any interest in that. I really enjoyed sailing. I taught on an old wooden sailing vessel out of Mystic Seaport and out of a program on Long Island. And I really learned that, it's true that can be 90% boredom and 10% terror. So, it's a hard thing to do, but I really liked it because it was like camping, but you didn't have to carry your stuff.
Yeah, okay.
So I love being out on the water. I'm very, I learned how to do celestial navigation at that time. I'm very involved with what's in the sky It's exciting to me to see that everybody else also is now, now that we have the interweb. You know, there are 3 or 4 planets out there right now. This month, February, there's a lot of planet activity. But I mean, and I guess that for me, that was also part of how we connect to the world around us, right? So it became part of what was important in my art practice, was the fact that I was really interested in how humans relate to other things.
Mhm.
And, you know, that's the sailing vessel. I mean, the reason I got interested in that is that sailing vessels traditionally are just a microcosm of the entire world. So, you know, all of those, any of those Melville books, Billy Budd, or they're the whole world. You know, Joseph Conrad, all of those writers, they're just writing about power.
Mhm.
We're not going to talk politics, so I can't get into how they relate to the world today, but they do.
Well, I was thinking when you said, you know, terror and boredom, I was thinking about watching the news. It's a combination of terror and boredom, but the ratios are different.
Yeah,
Anyway,
that's
before
true.
we go down that rabbit hole, Sondra, thank you so much for spending part of our evening, your evening, with us and being generous with your time, and your artwork is beautiful. And unless there are any other comments, I'm going to cut you loose. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and having me here. And if anyone is interested in being on my mailing list, just, you know, find my website and send me a note from there. That's the best way to do it. It's Sondra N. Arkin. The N is important. And thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye. See you
Bye,
soon.
everyone.
Bye. See you.
Bye. Thanks again.